Today, I want to talk about slavery. This is a topic that drives me absolutely wild. I find that there is no excuse and there is clear evidence of what the Bible actually says about slavery. I'm not talking about indentured servitude, I'm talking about slavery. I'm not talking about it's just part of the world and God was working around it. I'm talking about not just condoning it, but endorsing it and benefiting from it. When an atheist or agnostic or skeptic wants to talk about some issue they have with the Bible, it's usually one of two camps. We have an issue with why we don't believe the Bible, why the claims in the Bible are not true. Whether it's historical evidence or biblical contradiction or some kind of science error in the Bible, etc., there are many reasons to believe that the Bible is not an accurate source of truth, and thus that God is not real. That's one camp. The second camp is, okay, let's give you that Yahweh exists. Let's give you that the Bible is accurate, and let's take the Bible at its word. I may be forced to believe in this God. I'm not. But I'm not forced to worship this God. And here are all the reasons why I could never worship a God like this. And you can look at things like how the Bible treats women or children or genocide or war. But slavery, I think, is the one that is the easiest to just knock Yahweh right off the list. It's 2023 and slavery is alive and well in a large portion of this world. Some estimates say there are more slaves today than there have ever been. But in the Western world, wherever you are, most likely that you're watching this, slavery has been abolished and the consensus is that it is wrong. And another question I would pose to any believer watching this is, if I can show you that slavery is indeed endorsed by your God, the God of the Bible, I'd ask if there's any context that you can think of in the world that would justify owning slaves. My answer is very simple. I don't believe there's any context that would allow for owning slaves. Slavery is very real in the Bible and it's very endorsed by God himself. Therefore, God is not worthy of my worship if he even existed in the first place. What's more is so many of the Christian arguments about why God is real or why we need a God, why we need a moral law placed on our heart, how there's no objective source of morality or truth without a higher being or supernatural source, etc., boggle my mind, because even if that were true, we can't even agree on what these morals are. Name any major issue, any one at all: abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, and you have good Christians who read their Bible, who love their families, who spend time with God, and they come out with different ideas about what is right and what is wrong. And if you're a Christian and you're hearing that, as I used to, and it's so painful to say, well, those Christians who have the position X on this topic are just wrong. They're lost, they're deceived, the devil has a foothold, and the excuses are endless. So I wanted to talk about something that is so straightforward today, that is so obviously wrong. If you don't think slavery is wrong, take this time to leave a comment letting me know exactly why slavery is a-okay. So with that foundation, let's talk about what we're going to go through in today's video. I want to talk about slavery as it looks in the Old Testament, slavery as it's mentioned in the New Testament, the difference between indentured servitude and slavery, and what some of the top arguments from the Christian community or the apologists say about why it isn't what we think it is. We're going to read straight from the Bible, which is a wonderful thing to get to do because I don't have to read from some book that interprets something and make my case for why this is this. I can just tell you what the Bible says about slavery. And then we're going to follow that up immediately with a clip from Frank Turek, where he has his PowerPoint that he always has prepared during debates, that if someone brings up slavery, he can point to these things and the crowd cheers, and everyone kind of gets a little confused and forgets about the topic. And we're going to go through each of those points and talk about why they are utterly ridiculous, and more importantly, intellectually dishonest. So let's start with, I believe, one of the most damning verses in the entire Bible for Yahweh's character. So we're going to be reading from Leviticus 25, at this point, verses 44 through 45. Now, wait a second. The smart Christian says, that's the Old Testament. That doesn't apply. Don't you know Jesus came to break religion? Don't you know Jesus came to spread his message of love and truth? Well, we will get into what Jesus did and did not say about slavery and what the New Testament does and does not say about slavery. But don't you know that Jesus is not just God's son? Jesus is God. He was there at the beginning, according to the Bible. He is the author of this. So for today's purposes, let's just try to stay in one lane though. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, and we could just end right there and that would be it. But let's go on. You may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers and peoples of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. So there's a lot to unpack here. That very last verse where he's making this concession, you may make slaves of them, but over your brothers and the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. First of all, it doesn't say you should not rule over them, just not ruthlessly. As in opposition to what? What I just described, that from the nations around you or from the strangers that are in your land, own them as property, own them, pass them down to your sons forever. I can't believe the word is forever. And how do you think that they get treated when there's a caveat referencing back to the fact you can't treat your Israelite slaves or indentured servants ruthlessly? It sounds like an absolute free-for-all. So this is here. This is in your canon. This made the cut. After thousands of years of trimming and editing and canonization, it is still here. It's inexcusable. This is how I know most Christians don't read their Bible, and if they do, they pass over this with some confusion and move on. Or if maybe they go to their pastor and ask a question, or they pick up a good book on apologetics like, is God a moral monster? Which when I started having questions is what my pastor recommended to me. Making Sense of the Old Testament by Paul Copan. This book is disgusting in how it excuses slavery and completely disregards the more ridiculous verses like this. Now, before I show you the Turek video, I'm going to read a few verses before where they're talking about how to own the Israelites among you. So we have how to treat Israelite slaves and then how to treat foreign slaves. So let's go to the Israelites. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. So that is where we get this amazing argument. Anytime someone brings up slavery in the Bible, they say, no, you don't understand. It's not slavery the way we think of it. It was indentured servitude. It was a way to voluntarily sign yourself up to get out of a debt. Now, there are a ton of other verses through Exodus and Deuteronomy about both indentured servitude and about slavery in the way that we think about it and the way that verses 44 through 46 talk about it. And yes, do some atheists who are stupid use some of the verses incorrectly? Absolutely. And do some Christians utilize the verses in a way that suits their need? Yes. But the fact is that God condones both. Owning people for 7 years is what you get with the indentured servitude. And there's a whole host of things you can do to them. So when he says not to be ruthless, and then he describes what you can do to those indentured servants, it can only make you imagine the horrors that the other kinds of slaves from the nations around Israel went through.
First of all, Old Testament slavery was not race-based forced servitude. It was voluntary means of working off debt or keeping captives from mustering a rebellion. Secondly, slave trading is condemned in the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments. Thirdly, the Bible teaches that all men are made in the image of God. Slave and master are equally human, protected, and one in Christ. That's throughout both Old and New Testaments. Fourthly, Jesus came to set the captives free. And fifth, the Bible's main goal is spiritual redemption, not social reform. The Old Testament was not ideal. It was forward-looking to a better testament, which is the New.
All right, so there's the video. Let's go through his PowerPoint there. And I love that Frank Turek has a PowerPoint. And by the way, I'm not just straw manning this for the Christian side. This is a very similar argument that you get from this book, from guys, here's the deal. I didn't want to become an atheist. I didn't want there to be issues with the Bible. I didn't want the God that I loved and worshiped and called Good Father to end up being the bad guy. I looked everywhere for an excusable answer to that verse that I read you. I mean, I'll list all of the verses that deal with slavery in the description down below. But I didn't want to come to this conclusion. There's simply no excusing it. So let's go through his points and see what we think. Point number 1, Old Testament slavery is not race-based, and it's just to work off a debt and to keep people from mustering a rebellion. Well, this is really interesting because to keep people from mustering a rebellion, most of the time you'd be talking about when you invade another country and you take them captive because you didn't kill all of them and you don't want to leave people left that can come and rebel. But I guess you could also be talking about internally from the Israelite people, which means you're using it to solve problems, and it's also probably against their will, right? If they wanted to create a rebellion, but to squash that, you bring them into this indentured servitude. It doesn't sound like it was their idea of a way to pay off their debts. So the squashing a rebellion makes no sense, whether it's internally or externally. We know that it was race-based. It wasn't race-based in the same way that it was in the Americas, because in the Americas you have predominantly white people, although there were definitely black people and Native Americans that had slaves, that went to another country of a different race to enslave predominantly that other race. That's because we had big boats. Back then, you had the people who lived in your community, the Israelites, and then you had other nations. Even if they look like you, they were still other nations that, for all intents and purposes, is a different race. You were going outside of your clan and taking slaves from somewhere else because they were less than. God says the reason that you have to treat his Israelites so well during their indentured servitude is because they are his servants. He's like, guys, these are already my slaves, my servants. I did all this work to free them from Egypt when they were slaves, so you need to now treat them good. If you want to treat them bad, like the Egyptians treated you, then why don't you go elsewhere just like the Egyptians did? Isn't it amazing that there is this argument at all that slavery in the Old Testament doesn't matter, that it was culturally different, etc., etc., when the entire beginning of setting up this religion has to do with the exodus of God's chosen people from their horrendous capture and enslavement in Egypt. So we know God cares about slaves, but only of a certain kind, right? It's just so absolutely abhorrent. It's ridiculous. And of course, he's noting only the indentured servitude part. He didn't bring up the Bible verses on that slide, did he? He did not show that there is a unique difference between Israelite servants and slaves from other nations. That's dishonest. Frank Turek has read the Bible. He knows the two verses that follow what he's preaching about there, and he chose not to talk about them. That is dishonest. And he's not just a bad apple. This is representative of most apologists when they talk about slavery. Let's read point 2. It says, slave trading is condemned in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, condemned means that someone has taken a stance against it. Is there anything in what we just read, yet alone all of the other verses, that makes you think it's condemned? Now, there is a possibility, like we see in so much of the Bible, that God is speaking out of two sides of his mouth, and that in one spot he condones and endorses, and in another he condemns. But let's read these verses. The first one Frank Turek lists is Exodus 21:16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. Now, conveniently, we hear all the time from Christians that context is what matters. You can't just take a singular verse and use it to fit your narrative. You need to look at the context. Well, here's the context. This is found in Exodus 21, which is titled Laws About Slaves. But listen to the first line. Now, these are the rules that you shall set before them when you buy a Hebrew slave. And then it's a bunch of rules for how to treat your Hebrew slave. We already know from Leviticus that when you have a Hebrew slave, the rules are different. This is a very particular verse condemning a very particular kind of act against a particular member of the Hebrew or Israelite group that is to be treated less ruthlessly. This is not an argument against slavery at all. The next verse is 1 Timothy 1:10. The sexually immoral men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. It's just a list of bad things, and one of those bad things, by the way, homosexuality is a bad thing here. So is lying, which Rahab had no problem with and God blessed her for. But I digress before we go through all of these and how God doesn't actually care about any of them. And yeah, just very quickly listed here is enslavers. So I'll take it at its word. I could argue that, again, they're talking about the enslavement of Hebrews because we see elsewhere in the New Testament that there is not a condemnation against slavery. Let's give it the best footing we can for the Christian. Enslaving is wrong. So what do we do with that? I mean, that's the best outcome for Christians, is that there is a verse in the New Testament that says enslavement is wrong. So how do you justify that in your book that is cohesively written and authored and inspired by a perfect, all-knowing, benevolent being, we have contradictions? I'm not trying to set myself up for a win-win here, but either the Bible fully condemns slavery everywhere or it's wrong. Let's continue with the next point. Point 3 is that all are made in the image of Christ, and it lists both slave and non-slave. So first of all, we have an admission that there is slaves still to that day in the New Testament, post-Jesus. And here's what it says about it. Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. God is just saying that you're all one in me. This isn't a condemnation of slavery, just like it's not a condemnation of females or Greeks. It's simply saying, hey, all of those labels that we have here on earth, they don't matter to me. You're all my servants. I don't see how this helps the argument. What I do see in Galatians, if we skip down the page a little bit though, interestingly enough in Galatians 4:30, but what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. Now, if you know your Bible, this is an amazing reference back to Abraham and Sarah. You remember the patriarch of the entire religion, God's friend, the man who was willing to kill his son out of blind faith for God's favor. This man, when Sarah wasn't cutting it, his wife, decided he was going to use his slave Hagar for sexual purposes and to get another child. Well, it worked, except Sarah didn't like it. And she was so annoying to Abraham about it that he said, she's your slave, do what you want with her. So it's a little vague, but she did something to her slave that caused the slave with child to want to run away. Now, Turek and all the others go on to talk about how great it is to be a slave and how if you get away, you're fine. There were laws to protect you around this and it can actually benefit you, etc. So let's go back to Genesis 16 and find out how the rest of that story goes. Sarah dealt harshly with her, and then she fled from her. But don't worry, because in verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So that's what's being referenced in Galatians about the difference between being the son of a slave, Ishmael, or the true son of the freedman. And we see those lineages split. And that's, I'm not kidding, why there is so much hatred from the Christian community, especially longer times ago, against the Muslims, which is where it is believed that Ishmael's line led to. And that battle has been raging ever since because of God's what? God's punishment for a slave that was running from her mistress because the master of the house raped her and impregnated her, which pissed off Sarah. But she couldn't get away because God himself sent her back and told her to submit, and then essentially cursed everyone that was ever born. Again, according to this book, I'm not saying all Muslims are cursed. It's beyond ridiculous. But let's continue. Line 4, Jesus came to set the captives free, Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Again, I'm not going to dive into all of the context and history. We're taking a long time with this one particular video. Setting the captives free, healing the blind, things of this nature. First of all, we know that Jesus hasn't healed every single blind person, so I'm sure that he also has not unchained every single slave. We know for a fact that he didn't do that. He's obviously talking metaphorically here about sin. Sin makes you a captive, as we see so much. You are captive to your sin because why? The wages of sin is death. What did Jesus come to do? Jesus came to destroy death, to take the keys to death and Hades, right? That's what Jesus is talking about here. And Frank Turek knows that. I picture Frank sitting down at his desk thinking how he's going to talk about this thing that comes up in every one of his debates, slavery, and just looking for little verses that he can get that might distract from the argument, because that's all this is. This is a distraction. To the layman sitting back and looking at the slide and having some questions and being curious, I don't have to think about slavery anymore. Someone smarter than me, Frank Turek, whose job it is to know God better and know the Bible better, put these pretty slides up and told me I don't have to worry about this. It's not actually what this evil atheist man says it is. And that's how so many people continue to believe. They just don't read the Bible for themselves. And they rely on these awful, awful men. That is awful. It perpetuates. There were men just like Frank Turek in the 1700s, in the 1200s, in the 500s. There's always been people making excuses for the sins of this horrible book. And you know what it leads to? More horribleness. If you don't think that slavery as we know it in America was 100% justified for a very long time from verses in the Bible about slavery, you're ignorant. You're historically ignorant. Now, I know that America doesn't have slavery, so maybe Frank Turek doesn't look that bad, but him making concessions and excuses for slavery in the Bible is on par with allowing slavery to continue in the future by not putting a stop to all of the damage that we know this book does. And then the last point from Turek is my favorite because it actually contradicts the fourth point. He says that the Bible's main purpose is spiritual redemption, not social reform. Yeah, for sure. 100%. Just like your point 4 doesn't make any sense when Jesus says he sets the captives free. He's not talking about social reform. He's talking about spiritual redemption. So why on earth did you list point 4 except to be completely dishonest? I hear this a lot in all different kinds of conversations. Well, the Bible is not meant to be a science book when it gets the science wrong. Well, the Bible's not meant to be a history book when it gets the history clearly wrong. Well, it's not meant to be a social reform when it still allows slavery, when it still hates on homosexuals, etc. And yet, the Bible goes out of its way to give social reform. The Bible goes out of its way to list all the things that are good and all the things that are bad, and all the things you can do to people and all the things you can't do to people. The Bible talks about money. Jesus talks about money in the New Testament more than any other topic except maybe hell, I think. Plenty of social reform in economics. Talks about politics. It talks about chain of command for slaves, etc. To say that the Bible doesn't address social reform is ridiculous. It addresses it. It may not be the main point of it, but anytime that it opens its mouth to tell you how to have a society, it is almost inherently wrong and destructive to the vast majority of individuals. If the Bible was only about salvation, hey, here's Jesus, you need to know him, here's the concept of original sin, it would still be totally bollocks, right? But at least we wouldn't be using it to continue to commit atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. But since it does go out of its way to talk about how we should live our life physically here on earth, and it continues to tell us the wrong way or a harmful way to do so, then yes, I'm sorry, this is a book about social reform in addition to a greater goal of spiritual redemption. Fine, but not an excuse. So I had intended to go through the indentured servant side and point out that even if this is all there is in the Bible, which clearly it's not, it's about true slavery, it's still atrocious. And I'm not going to go through nearly the amount of examples that I was going to, but I want to read you a couple things. And the reason that I'm doing this is because, again, please, YouTube, Google, however you'd want to search for information, slavery in the Bible. Is slavery in the Bible wrong? What does the Bible say about slavery? And you will get nothing but Christian websites, Christian pastors, apologists, etc., Christian YouTubers who point out over and over and over, it's their only argument. No, people get it wrong. It's indentured servitude and it's actually beneficial. In fact, that verse where it talks about indentured servitude, it's labeled a kindness to brothers because we're allowing you to get out of your debt. But let's look at what that actually looks like. So we'll jump over to Exodus where we get laws about social justice, laws about restitution, and laws about slaves. So in Exodus 21:20, we have, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and that slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Great. Great. And do you know how many times this is pointed out? No, guys, listen, slavery was here long before Mosaic law and long after. God didn't come to be a social justice warrior, but he did give some regulation to it. Look, there's a punishment if you kill your slave. Let's read one verse further. But if the slave survives a day or two, so not even in general, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. So this translation has his money. Most translations have his property. So listen, if you end up killing a slave, but it takes too long, can we really say it was your fault? No vengeance. If you kill a slave immediately, it's obvious that was it. We're going to have to do something about that because we don't want people just killing slaves. We need this workforce. But if you beat your slave as much or as often as you want, as long as they can get back up in a couple days, you are fine because it's your money and or your property. So this is what I love. And there's other verses about, you get in trouble or you have to set your slave free if you knock out their eye or their tooth. But you can break their bones and bruise them and rape them and do whatever you want as much as you want. So there's these limits, this regulation that everyone points to and how it's so good. It's a way to get rid of your debts. And yeah, it looks like a service contract instead of slavery. But the rules for this are absolutely asinine, and it would not be okay in any workforce ever. It's disgusting. Stop using it as an excuse. It's so, so bad. I also want to read to you something else because I think we've talked a lot about slavery and work. I want you guys to hear from God himself on sexual slavery. So this is going to be from Deuteronomy 21. And if you go down to verse 10, it's talking about marrying female captives. Listen to this. When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head. I had to read that so many times. And pare her nails. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother for a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you no longer delight in her, though, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. You can obviously treat her as a slave while she's still your wife. In fact, the word wife and the word slave are almost interchangeable in most of the Bible. Now, again, I can't tell you how many times I've seen this verse referenced as the good things God does for women. Literally, the audacity of people to say, listen, her husband was most likely just murdered, and her children either didn't make it or they're virgins themselves, so they're going into the sex trade, which is another verse where it talks about after a genocide that the only people you should leave alive are the virgins. I wonder why you're leaving them alive. This woman's family has just been wiped out. She's lost her home. She's lost any ground of comfort whatsoever. She's in a strange land, potentially a strange language and customs, but we have mercy from God. She gets to mourn for a whole month before she starts getting raped on the daily basis. Christians talk about this like, oh, look, he did the right thing. He made her his wife. She's already a wife. She already has a husband who you murdered so you could increase the land for the chosen people, or because you were offended by the God they worshipped, as if any of these people have a right to be offended by a different God. But it's used as justification for most of the genocides of all the neighboring clans and tribes. And then the last part is what kills me. And again, Christians point to this as something good. Look, guys, she can go free. She can only go free if she's so sexually unpleasant that she's no longer worth anything to the man. And by the way, do you think that that man is just, he tried it once and now he's done? No, he'll go take another woman after he kills her husband. So if I can find a better slave that sexually suits me better, I'll let you go. And don't worry, I won't treat you as a slave anymore. You can go wherever you want. I'm not even going to get money for you. Not because it's the right thing to do. I'm not going to be able to get money because, what is the word? I've humiliated you, meaning he's had sex with her, because sex is so humiliating for a woman and it literally ruins her value. This is a lot where purity culture comes from in the Christian religion. People don't see how sick it is linked back to this, but I heard it in Christian schools growing up. I was there when they talked to the girls and they used the horrendous example of you're like a piece of tape or bubble gum, whichever example you like better. I heard both. And if you give yourself to men before marriage, you lose your stickiness, you lose your flavor, you literally become worth less for what you are if you have given away your sexuality before you marry the man. Now, was that ever told to us men? No. And it comes from this crap. This is what I mean when I say religion is still harmful. The ideology here is disgusting. So if you're okay with this, tell me how. I wanted to be okay with this. I tried. There's no way to justify this stuff. All right, let's move on to the New Testament. So a lot of Christians or apologists who try not to get too involved with all that nastiness in the Old Testament, but still want to talk about slavery, will reference some New Testament verses and say, see, God doesn't want anyone to be slaves. Now there's two camps that these verses fall into. First camp is kind of like that one I read earlier from Galatians in the New Testament, where it has nothing to do with the physical act of slavery. It has to do with being captive in your sin, being held accountable in your sin for death, which is God's problem, not mine, not slaves, has nothing to do with it. So there's a ton of talk in the New Testament about being free, and God wants us to be free and things of this nature. And if you look at the context, I'm not going to go through all of them. It has nothing to do with slavery. The second kind is, they use a much better term now than servant, slave, indentured servant, which, by the way, the Bible never says indentured servant. It just doesn't, or indentured servitude or anything like that. It's very clear, like it still calls them slaves. It calls them the same thing that it talks about for the foreigners, because at the end of the day, you are not your own under this. But I digress. They call it bond servants most of the time in most New Testament translations, which again is not quite fair. It's definitely still slaves. I'll read you some of these verses. The first one is 1 Corinthians 7, and let's pick up at 21. Were you a bondservant when called, being called to Christ? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a free man of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called is a bondservant of Christ. What a lot of people don't understand about the New Testament, and what that other verse in Galatians was referring to, is the difference between Jew and Gentile, and sometimes Gentile is referred to as the Greek. The Jews were God's chosen people. That's Old Testament, and everyone else is essentially an enemy. And then with Christ's death, we get the ability to be grafted in, to become part of the family. Well, part of the family means becoming the same as a Jew, which is why Gentiles didn't have to circumcise or anything like that to join the cult. They simply were grafted in, paid for with the blood magic of God killing himself to himself for a couple days. So they're part of the family. But what is the family? Everyone is a servant of God. We saw that in the Old Testament, and we see it here. So yeah, if you're called as a bondservant, well, you know what? You're not really a slave to me. Don't you know that? You're grafted in now. And if you can get out of your slavery, you should go for it. That's what this verse says. What about, I made a mistake in the Old Testament and I've come to right those wrongs and I'm abolishing slavery? What about that? What about, even, it would be so gross, but even, hey, if you become a Christian, Christians should not be subject to slavery. So when you come to know me, I will end your slavery. Even that would be better, but it's not that. It's just, hey, if you are one, no big deal, you're mine anyways. And if you can get out of it, you probably should. That's what this verse says. This is one of the verses pointed to all the time from Christians in the New Testament. Let's go to the next one. This one comes to us from Colossians. This is Colossians 4:1. Masters, treat your bond servants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Masters, let your slaves go. No, wait. So I do love that God finally compares himself to the ultimate slave owner, and we are all his slaves, or the ultimate servant owner, and we are all his servants. And yeah, there seems to be a palpable difference in the New Testament about treating these slaves a little better, not freeing them. And by the way, again, I'm not going to go through all of it, but you saw some of the examples of how you were supposed to treat the Jewish or Hebrew indentured servants. It's not good, but God described that as not being ruthless. So when he says treat them well, who knows what that means? This is not convincing. This is not a good argument to me. This does not take away from everything else. Let's go to the next one. Philemon 1:15. Now, Philemon is just a little bitty one-chapter book, so give me a second. Right before Hebrews. So we have Paul, and he is talking to his buddy Philemon, and via this letter. And what so Paul met a slave in jail, an escaped slave, Onesimus or Onesimus, I've heard both. Paul recruited him, and he was like, hey, this slave is pretty smart. I could put him to use. And so here's his plea to his master. For this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So if you consider me your partner, receive him as you would receive me. If he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge it to my account. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. I will repay it, to say nothing of your owing me, even of your own self. Yes, brother, I want some benefits from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ. Confident of your obedience, I write to you, knowing that you will do even more than I say. So that's it. This is so gross. This is, I'm getting a little triggered actually, thinking back to all of the ways that I was asked/told what to do. I know you'll do the right thing in Christ. I know that for God, you'll be honorable here. It's the way that Christians speak, and it really started with Paul. But he is still not in charge of Onesimus, because why? Because he respects the institution of slavery. So we have a runaway slave, and if their indentured servitude was so good, why are there so many conversations, issues, stories, and regulations for what to do with an escaped slave. So he escaped. He finds himself in prison. He's about to be returned to his master. And Paul says, could you make him a missionary instead? I think he would be of more use to me and Christ and thus you. And you owe me one, buddy. This does not reflect God's heart on ending all slavery. This is if someone can be utilized in a better way, he can travel with me and aid me in my missionary work if he's not a slave to you. So please set him free. That's all that this is. And I've seen this verse used to no end to talk about God's heart for the slave or the servant. So I'm not going to keep going. This has already been so much longer than I wanted it to be. I think that I've done a pretty good job playing it fair, really showing the strongest cases that can be made. The fact of the matter is there's just not a strong case to be made on the Christian side. Do I think most Christians today are in favor of slavery? No. Do I think that the people who are in their Sunday service praising God, calling him good Father, love slavery and bloodlust? No. But they've taken a few nice parts of the Bible and they are living their lives according to those nice parts, but you can do it without the Bible and you can do it without a belief in something that is not there. And the problem I have with, and I've mentioned this before, and I get this question a lot, I've got it in a lot of the comments, is, why do you care so much if most Christians today are good people and look at all the good they do? Can't you see they do good? Of course they can. And of course they're good people. And can non-Christians do bad things too? Absolutely. And has slavery existed in non-religious regimes? Yes. Slavery is a concept of humanity. And so I don't blame Christianity for creating slavery. And God is not real. And so I don't blame God for creating slavery. But slavery has continued longer than it should in many places because of religion. Allowing this foothold of something that is so untrue and so evil if it were true is a net loss over any of the good that is being done. Because again, that good can be done without it. But the bad oftentimes cannot be done. There's a quote that I've talked about before that I really love. Good people sometimes do good things, bad people sometimes do bad things. But for a good person to do something bad usually requires religion. And I think that's so true because as soon as you can call something that otherwise you would say is morally wrong or bad or harmful or disbeneficial, holy, or for the will of God, all of a sudden it becomes a good thing. But it's not a good thing. It's still harmful. It's still disadvantageous, etc. So, by the way, the last thing I'll say is when I was a Christian and I first started grappling with this, first of all, I didn't grapple with it for a long time. I knew those verses. I knew there was slavery in the Old Testament. I knew there was genocide in the Old Testament. And I just figured there was something I didn't understand. God's way is higher than mine. And there were so many pretty verses. And it was more about salvation and telling the gospel message and saving people. And a lot of very smart people said that there was nothing to worry about. And they excused it. And I listened. And I didn't research. And when I became a parent, I decided that I needed to be responsible for what I was going to teach my children. And so I needed to fully understand my position of belief. And I dug in more than I had ever dug in, and I needed to be able to account for and answer everything that God stood for, and I simply could not do it. And slavery is not the only thing, but it's the easiest thing to point to and talk about, so I thought we'd start there. So that's it. Thank God I have finally made the video on slavery and I can be done with it. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you on the next one.